everybody, welcome back to another episode of Martian's Guide to the Galaxy, and as always, we will be your guide to infinity and beyond.
We are discussing a new topic this week. We have a book titled Martian Chronicles. It's by Ray Bradbury, a pretty famous science fiction author. So we're going to be reviewing this book, talking about our thoughts and everything in between when it comes to Martian Chronicles. Specifically, we are going to be talking about a chapter from the book called Usher 2. It's kind of towards the farther end of the book, but we really enjoyed it. My entire group really enjoyed this chapter, and we thought it had some great points that we would want to talk about. So without further ado, here's our thoughts on Usher 2.
I think some initial thoughts about Usher 2 are that the house is very creepy and very kind of gloomy and unwelcoming, and I think that could ultimately deter people from going near it. And that could be because Mr. Stendhal doesn't want people bothering him. And also in that chapter, we've learned that all the literature on Mars is burned. And I think that could also represent kind of the fear of the unknown and kind of the fear of what we don't understand. And I think that's definitely something that humans struggle with in society, is the fear of the unknown.
So after the initial thoughts, discussion of key elements. So that will be characters, plot, theme, conflict, setting, literary elements. So first, characters. There are a good number of characters in this chapter of the Martian Chronicles, but I have to say not that many of them are very important. There's only a few characters that I would say are main in this chapter because a lot of them are just party goers. For our main characters, we have William Stendhal, who is the creator of Usher 2 that he built on Mars based off of the House of Usher. The other character would be Mr. Bigelow. So if I remember correctly, Mr. Bigelow is the mastermind who helped Stendhal create his house, and he did a lot of architecture, and I think he built some robots for Stendhal in order to create the house. And then we have Mr. Garrett, who is investigator of moral climates. So he's one of the moral climates people that comes to investigate Stendhal's House of Usher, or Usher 2. And so he's actually the main point in this story because we see him come to the house, kind of talk over with Stendhal, and then he's actually killed by one of Stendhal's robots. But the man, the robot was Mr. Garrett also, so he actually didn't die at first, but then the other Mr. Garrett came and was killed in a untimely manner. So those are the three really main characters. We also have everyone at the party who's kind of secondary characters, and we also have literary characters such as Alice in Wonderland characters like Tweedledee and Tweedledum, the Headless Horseman, and others like them.
The basic plot of this chapter is William Stendhal recreates the House of Usher, but Mr. Garrett from the Moral Climates comes to investigate the house because it's based off of stories by various authors. And Stendhal ultimately kills Garrett using one of his robotic apes. And so Stendhal has Pikes recreate a robotic version of Mr. Garrett to send back to Moral Climates. And it turns out that the Mr. Garrett who came to investigate the house was also a robot. So the real Mr. Garrett returned for a follow-up inspection. And at the same time, Stendhal threw a party for a bunch of people. And at that party, Stendhal gradually starts killing the people at the party and replacing them with robots. And that includes Garrett. And he replaces them with robotic replicas of themselves. And after the party, the second House of Usher is destroyed, and Pikes and Stendhal fly off in a helicopter after the house crumbles to the ground. I think some of the basic themes of this chapter, and I think they were mentioned in the initial thoughts, was fear of the unknown, kind of the fear of something we as humans don't understand. Also, difficulty with accepting change. I think that that we as humans don't really like change, and we want to stay where we are, and we don't like having to change or morph to or adapt to anything. And I also think that we as humans censor knowledge. I think that we kind of do that as a control, like we like to control what people know. So I think we censor knowledge a lot. The conflict in this chapter could be character versus character or character versus society. Character versus character being Mr. Stendhal and Pikes versus Mr. Garrett and the Moral Climates. But it also could be character versus society and being Mr. Stendhal versus the society on Mars, because the people on Mars didn't want people to be able to read books, so they burned all of them. And so there was a big conflict there because Mr. Stendhal was very against that. The setting of this chapter is the House of Usher 2, which is the house Mr. Stendhal built on Mars. And the time frame was April of 2005.
Also, we are going to talk about the literary elements that we found in this book. There are so many literary elements in the Martian Chronicles, it's actually crazy. But the ones we're going to focus on today are some that me and Olivia found while glancing through this book. And honestly, it didn't take much effort because there are so many elements that Ray Bradbury put into this novel. So the first one we found was personification, and that was on Bradbury page 103, and it says, the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens. So we thought that this would be a personification instance because clouds cannot hang, really. I would say that they can like float, but I think hanging is like something that people do. Next one is metaphor, which is on page 105. It says, oh, it started very small. In 1950 and 60, it was a grain of sand. So they are directly calling the things written in here, they're calling it a grain of sand, and it's obviously not a grain of sand. I'm pretty sure they're talking about censoring books and cartoons and whatnot. So it's not literally a grain of sand, but that because they are directly saying this censorship is a grain of sand, that would be a metaphor. So next we have connotation, and that's on Bradbury, page 103. So it says, the melancholy House of Usher. So the House of Usher itself, I'm pretty sure that you could say, so this also goes back to Edgar Allan Poe's work, but the title House of Usher sounds very cold, very distant, not exactly somewhere you'd like to live in. If I was to say the home of Usher, however, that would be a positive connotation because you feel at home, it's happy. But when it's House of Usher, it's a negative connotation. So that's our connotation. Next we have a simile, and that one is on page 106. It says, I came to Mars to get away from you clean-minded people, but you're flocking in thicker every day like flies too awful. So when it says, but you're flocking in thicker every day like flies to awful, like flies would be a simile between the people are being compared to flies. So next we have irony. I think I've already mentioned this. Basically, irony we put, is that me down there, said Mr. Steffens, appearing at Garrett's elbow. He bent over the pit. How strange, how odd to see yourself die. So that is very ironic and kind of funny in a very morbid way, because that right there is talking about that the robot of Mr. Steffens is the one who's watching, and Mr. Steffens is down there actually dying. It's like kind of funny because he thinks he's seeing he's seeing his robot die when no, everyone thinks it's a robot, but no, it's him. You're watching an actual guy die. And the thing is, they aren't really reacting to it. And I also think this shows a lot about characters in the human race when it comes to this book as well. They're not really reacting to his death because they just think it's a robot. And even seeing this horrible tragedy in front of you, they don't care because they think it's not a real person when it is. So next we have a symbol. They began by controlling books of cartoons and then detective books and of course films. So that is Bradbury, page 105. So the symbol here is books, and I already kind of talked about this in the theme, but books really signify knowledge in like almost everything. So because we see the books being burned, it's like knowledge being destroyed. So the symbol here is books equal knowledge. And then we also have alliteration. So the very beginning of the chapter, we have alliteration, and it says, during the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day. That's the beginning of the sentence, but it has during, dull, dark, and day, which is 4 D's. So now we'll do a discussion of how the section connects to other pieces of literature, historical events, and group members' lives.
In another one of his works, Fahrenheit 451, the books in that story were also burned, just like how the Moral Climates burned all the books in this chapter. And there were also a lot of references to Edgar Allan Poe works. There's also an example in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix where the Ministry restricts the amount of knowledge that the fifth years are learning in their defensive magic. So that's also an example of knowledge censorship. On a scale of 1 to 10 for comprehension, I think I would give this chapter about a 7 because it was pretty easy to understand the storyline, but if you didn't know some of the things it referenced, I think it would have made it a little harder to understand. As for the entertainment value of it, I think I would give it a 8 or 9 because I thought the kind of the dark irony of killing people at the party, I thought that was very interesting the way that was written. I think as for if there was a message or not, I think that there definitely was. I think that I would give that about an 8 or 9. I think there was a lot of deeper messages in this chapter about, again, censoring knowledge and fear of the unknown, and I think I mentioned a lot of those earlier.
I gotta give it I have to be honest, I'm gonna give it like a 5. I think the book is interesting, and I think the chapter was probably one of the more interesting ones, but it's just not something that appeals to me, and I think that the story was kind of scary, and I don't like scary things, so, you know, that's how it goes. For comprehension, I give it a 3. So I think that, like, Bradbury, I think he, his works aren't incredibly hard to understand. It's not like Old English or anything, but he does use dialect a lot, and when he uses that, it kind of makes it harder to understand when they're talking, and also, I would say it's almost like he talks in like really, really long sentences. Next, we have entertaining. Was the chapter entertaining? Yes. Was the book entertaining? Was the chapter interesting? I personally thought it was one of the best chapters, and that's why I chose it, because it had characters from other literature that I thought was really cool. It's like a cameo from Rapunzel, or like Alice in Wonderland. I just thought that was really interesting. So that, oh, and also the Edgar Allan Poe works that were featured in it, it made it really interesting for me. So yes, I really thought it was pretty entertaining. Next we have, was there a message? So obviously I'm going to score this one really highly, guys, because I mean, this entire book is like a slap in the face. So next we have an interview with an expert. Her name is Kylie, and we will be talking to her. And I'm just like really excited to hear what she has to say. And we're gonna ask her a few questions about the book, and she's going to tell us what she thinks. And after this, we're gonna have a fun little element in today's podcast. We're gonna be doing a quiz or a challenge. So this should be really interesting.
Hey guys, thanks for having me. I am an English major. I've written my thesis on the Martian Chronicles, and I'm going to start with a little biography of the author. Ray Douglas Bradbury. He was born in Waukegan, Illinois on August 22nd, 1920. He died in Los Angeles, California on June 5th, 2012. Bradbury was a very famed science fiction author. Some of his trademarks themes were writing were themes of nostalgia and using science fiction to explore the darker side of humanity. He also had a very poetic and metaphorical way of writing.
When reading this chapter, did you think Bradbury expected his readers to have already read Edgar Allan Poe's works, such as The House of Usher, The Cask of Amontillado, or The Pit and the Pendulum?
So that's a good question. It really depends. I feel that, yes, Edgar Allan Poe most likely would have been read before reading this book. I do think that he did expect that, but it also depends because a lot of people don't like Edgar Allan's way of thinking and his works. So people reading this book might be confused on who he is. But I think really it just depends on who has read the Edgar Allan Poe stories. And I think he did a pretty good job on not explaining it, but making sure that people can still read his book without having to know about this author.
Yes, Usher 2 also displays a theme of censoring creativity, such as in fairy tales and fantasy books. Do you think that Bradbury believed that this was actually happening in society, or that it would happen in the future? And if so, why do you find that this is the case?
I do think that he is writing about if the way a part of the society was acting, this could turn out to be what it is. And this is almost like a warning in his books. I think Ray Bradbury puts a lot of warnings and lots of visions into the future into this book. He, I think, felt that might be the case. He might have felt that was the case, but I don't think it was that big of a worry in his time of day or even right now. Now, I have some questions for you guys. I have a little quiz questions for you. So my first question is, who was the first guest to be killed in Stendhal's party?
I'm gonna go with Cindy. That's gonna be so wrong. Cindy, like Cindy Lou Who.
Miss Blunt was the first person to be killed at Stendhal's party.
Okay, so Miss Blunt was. The second question is, where did Mr. Garrett work?
Mr. Garrett worked for the Moral Climates.
Moral Climates.
Yeah, Moral Climates. The third question is, how many Edgar Allan Poe works were mentioned in this chapter?
3. There's 3.
7 Edgar Allan Poe works were mentioned in this chapter.
3 Edgar Allan Poe works were mentioned in Usher 2 chapter. Why is Mr. Stendhal's house called Usher 2?
Mr. Stendhal's house is called Usher 2 because he built it based off of Edgar Allan Poe's House of Usher.
It was called Usher 2 because Mr. Stendhal and Edgar Allan Poe, he really liked him and he respected all of his works, and then they got burned and he wanted to make an homage to Edgar Allan Poe, so he created a house called Usher 2 based on the House of Usher from Edgar Allan Poe's work. Whew. Got it.
It's because he wanted to make an homage to Edgar Allan Poe because he feels he's losing the fantasy and creativity from this famous author. So I think he was trying to make almost a statement using that author. And then the last question is, name 3 fairy tales that were mentioned in this chapter.
3 fairy tales. Rapunzel, Alice in Wonderland, The Wizard of Oz.
3 fairy tales that were mentioned in this chapter was Alice in Wonderland, The Headless Horseman, and Rapunzel.
So you could have picked from a series of answers. The ones I got were Rapunzel, The Wizard of Oz, etc. There's a couple of fairy tales mentioned in that book that he kind of destroyed. But yeah, that is the end of my little quiz. Thank you guys so much for having me. I will talk to you guys later.
Thank you guys for watching. Next week we'll be back with Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, so look forward to that. This was really fun for us to make. We have another podcast called A++++, and it's where we discuss whether or not it's possible for a teacher to give you extra credit, and I can tell you now, it's very possible. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys later.